What's up everyone? In this lesson, I'm going to be talking about intervals. By the end of this video, you're going to have a very strong understanding of interval size and quality, how to quickly identify intervals depending on how they're arranged on the staff, inversion, and how accidentals affect intervals. My name is Mathew. I'm a composer and cellist and the founder of the Sound Painters Studio, which is a virtual online studio that meets every single week for composers to be able to get consistent feedback and support while they develop their music. I'm doing these music theory videos so that composers and musicians can acquire the basics of music theory so that they can bring their music to life with a greater amount of control and emotional depth. So let's get into intervals. The first thing that we should establish is what an interval is. Basically, an interval is the distance from one note to another. And we measure this with two main factors. The first one is interval size, and the second is interval quality. Let's first just talk about interval size. So we're going to start off with middle C. If we place middle C right next to itself, we form what is known as a unison, which is a distance of 1, which I know sounds counterintuitive, but that's the way it works in musical intervals. And as you ascend the scale, if we do a C major scale, the next interval up would be a second. So you always count including the note itself, 1, 2. After that, we would get a third, and then a fourth, and then a fifth, and so on until you reach the octave C above it. At this point, you might be wondering how you actually identify interval size, and later in the video, I'm going to give you some tips for quick identification. But before that, one of the strategies that I have found, particularly for larger intervals, is to try to just break it down into smaller intervals that we already know. So let's take, for example, C to A, which is a larger interval. So this distance at a glance might be a little bit hard to figure out. So you could just count the steps like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and determine that this is a sixth. Or you could break it into smaller intervals from C to E. We know this is a 3. And from E to A, we know this is a 4. And then what we can do is add 3 plus 4 and then subtract 1 from it, which equals 6. Now, this is slightly more convoluted, but just to explain this music math here, remember that when we count intervals, we start from the first note counting itself. And so when we add 3 plus 4, obviously becomes 7th, which is not the interval that we're looking at. So we have to subtract the starting note from this equation for it to work. You could also combine these two approaches. So let's say, for example, that you want to count some notes, but not all of them. This can sometimes be quite effective, especially if it's just 1 or 2 steps away from the interval you recognize. So let's again say that we have C to E. We know this is a 3, then you can just do 4, 5, 6, and then you find the 6th by counting from the 3. These would be a few different strategies for identifying interval size. So once you get to this interval, the octave, it's not called an eighth, but an octave. An octave is basically just when you get the same note, so for example, C, in different octaves. And you'll notice this on the piano. Once you reach that octave threshold, there are two ways that you could go about labeling these intervals. The most common way would just be to continue this pattern, and the next one after the octave would be a ninth. So if we write middle C and then go one step up from that octave, we're going to get a ninth, which is essentially an octave plus a second. If you continue in this pattern, you're going to get the next intervals up. So one thing to keep in mind is that once you get to 2 octaves, most people don't really refer to this as a 15th because it starts to become a little bit cumbersome. If you continue the pattern and call the next octave up a 16th, people are not really going to have that information available to them. It's more likely that they would just say like an octave plus a ninth or 2 octaves plus a second. So depending on the context, you may hear people referring to these intervals in different ways. So the first would be 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th. The second would be to refer to the octave plus the interval, or 2 octaves plus the interval away from the starting note. Or another way that is fairly common to refer to these as seconds, thirds, fourths, fifths, even though the actual size is 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th. and so on. And this is basically just a shorthand to be able to refer to these intervals quickly, even if the actual size of the interval exceeds an octave. So I would just use the label that makes the most sense. If the actual octave displacement is going to be really important for the way that you're talking about this interval, then I would suggest using 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, and so on. But if it's not super important and you just want to talk about a specific interval regardless of the registration, then you can refer to it as a 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and so on. Some people are going to get really nitpicky about this, so use your best judgment. I hope that people can learn to be more flexible in the future. It's going to change depending on the context. If you're talking with songwriters and jazz composers, it's more likely that they're going to say 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th. If you're talking with classical musicians, they may or may not refer to these as 10ths, 11ths, 12ths. They might say octave plus a 3rd, octave plus a 4th, and so on. So as long as you know both of these languages, so to speak, if you have these in your vocabulary, you'll be fine. Let's talk about some quick ways that we can identify these on the staff. So there are basically 3 main ways that you can identify intervals quickly on the staff. You can think about line to line, space to space, or line to space / space to line, which are essentially the same thing. So let me explain. If we start with line to line, let's start with the note E, which is on the bottom of the staff. If we put an E right next to it, this is going to be a unison, which we already know. If we go to the next line up, we're going to get a 3rd. If we go to the next line after that, we're going to get a 5th. The next line up after that is going to be a 7th. You probably already guessed that if we continue doing this, we would continue to get odd numbered intervals. And that's true. Now, remember, when you add ledger lines, we're basically still doing line notes or space notes. If it has a line through it, it's a line note. If it's on top of the line, it's a space note. So let's look at the space notes. If we start on the note F and we put an F right next to it, we're going to get a unison. If we go to the next space up, we're going to get a 3rd. Go to the next space up, it's a 5th. Next space up is a 7th, and so on. So again, both of these, line to line and space to space, are going to give you odd numbered intervals. If you start mixing space and line or line and space, that's where the even numbered intervals are going to appear. So let's see that play out in action. So if we start on an E and go up to an F, so in this case we have line to space, we get a 2nd. After that, we go to the next space up, because you would go to whatever the upper note's position is. If it's a line, you go to the next line up. If it's a space, you go to the next line up. So it's whatever the first lower note is not. So in this case, we go up to the next space and we get a 4th. Then you go up to the next space, you get a 6th. The next space would be the octave, and so on. If you start from a space, so let's start from the note F. Next line up would be a 2nd. The next line up after that would be a 4th. The next line up after that would be a 6th, and so on. So it works in exactly the same way. When you do line to space or space to line, you're going to get even numbered intervals. So this is a really helpful way for being able to quickly identify the intervals on the staff, because let's say that you're trying to identify line to line. So we look at the lines, obviously when they're next to each other, it's a unison. If they're 2 lines away, it's going to be a 5th. And that's going to be true if it were 2 spaces away as well. Now, we're not necessarily identifying what kind of 5th it is. We just know it's a 5th. So we understand the interval size. So when we're talking about these quick identification tips, we're talking specifically about size. But this is only half of the equation, right? Because if you remember earlier, we have interval size and we have interval quality. So let's now talk a little bit more in depth about interval quality, because obviously if we listen to these different intervals on the piano, we're going to get some different results sonically. So I'm going to play these on the piano and we're just going to get a sense of how these differ from these 2 starting points, E versus F. So let's start first from E and play each of those line to line notes. So if we start on E, and then we have the first line up, next line up, next line up. Let's now think about F. We have our unison, then we have a 3rd, then we have a 5th, 7th, 9th. So these are different. So now let's talk about interval quality. Let's think in terms of a key signature with no sharps or flats, because I think this is the easiest and fastest way to be able to identify interval quality. So let's think in C major. If we have every single interval from C, then we can add what the qualities for each of these corresponding intervals is going to be. So we already know that we have a unison, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and octave. But we need to understand what kinds of qualities we have as well. So there are essentially 5 different kinds of qualities: diminished, minor, major, augmented, and perfect. Now it's really important when we think about interval quality to remember that not all intervals can be all of these qualities. If an interval falls under the category of minor or major, then the only other alternatives that it's going to have is diminished and augmented. If an interval is perfect, it can only be augmented or diminished. So now we have to understand which intervals can be part of which path. For diminished, minor, major, augmented intervals, we can have seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths. For intervals that can be diminished, perfect, or augmented, we can only have unisons, fourths, fifths, and octaves. There's no such thing as a major fifth, a major fourth, a major unison, a major octave. It can only be perfect fourth, a perfect fifth, a diminished fifth, an augmented fifth, and so on. So it's really important to keep these 2 categories separate. So let's see in the C major scale what kinds of intervals we actually have. So obviously when you have one note next to itself, it's going to just be a regular unison. And in this case, since it's the same note and there's no change to either of them, we would call it a perfect unison. And we can abbreviate this with a P. So in terms of abbreviations, we have for diminished, you can use a lowercase d. For minor, we can use a lowercase m with a slash over it so that it's really clear it's lowercase. For major, we can use a capital M. For augmented, we can use an A. And for perfect, we can use a capital P. In this case, we have a perfect unison. You can also say perfect 1. Here we have a major second. Here we have a major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, perfect octave. These would be the interval sizes and qualities from the starting note C up to the C above it. In order to understand how you would distinguish why this is a major second, we need to understand how many semitones are between these 2 notes. So if you remember from our previous video on the major scale, since we know that this is a whole step, we have 2 semitones. So if a second is 2 semitones away, so if I play this on the piano, and I can squeeze in another semitone, it's a major second. If you cannot squeeze in an extra semitone, it's a minor second. Now, obviously, if we were gonna start on a different point of the scale, we're gonna get different intervals. So let's look at a different point in the scale. Let's start on the note D. If we start on D and put another D right next to it, obviously this is gonna be, again, a perfect unison. If we go from D to E, we have to think how many half steps can we squeeze in here. So if we know that the distance from D to E can be filled with an extra semitone in the middle, so we have D, D sharp, E, then we know that this must be a major second. If we go from D to F, we have to think, in this case, D to E is a whole step, E to F, since we can't squeeze in any extra semitones between it, would be a minor third. So we can continue looking at all of these intervals, and we would find what these qualities would be. In this case, I've reached D to B. So we know that we're mixing lines and spaces. D is a space note, B is a line note, so it must be an even numbered interval. So you can always filter out what the options are not. It can't be an odd numbered interval, so it can't be a unison, third, fifth, seventh, etc. It must be a second, a fourth, or a sixth. Since we know that it's not D to D, it can't be an octave, so it must be smaller than an octave. Therefore, in this case, since it's 3 lines away, after the space, it must be a sixth. One of the ways that you can determine what kind of sixth this is to break it down into smaller intervals that are easier to identify. So if we already know that D to A is a perfect fifth, then you look at the distance from A to B, and if that is a half step, we're gonna have a minor sixth, and if it's a whole step, it's a major sixth. So that's the quickest way you can identify it, is using information that you already have, either from previous analysis or just previous knowledge or what you already remember from the past. So I would encourage you to practice this exercise, going through all of the different starting points of a C major scale and identifying what the intervals are going to be. Now, there are going to be certain kinds of fourths or fifths that you'll find specifically starting on the notes B or F, which are not going to be perfect. And these are the only cases in the entire scale where that would be the case. So let's just look at a fourth starting from F. We know that we have a space note, and even numbered intervals must be a mix between space and line. So we start on the first line up, that's a second, next line up is a fourth. So you write it on that line. That's a fourth. Now this is not a perfect fourth because a perfect fourth would be 2 whole steps plus a half step. In this case, what we have is 3 whole steps. So if we know that F to A is a major third and A to B is a whole step above the major third is actually going to be an augmented fourth. 3 whole steps away would be an augmented fourth. Now, if we go back to our qualities, if we can have a perfect interval like a perfect fourth, then the only path once you expand beyond that would be augmented, which is exactly what we have in the case of F to B. If you started on B instead and you tried to build a fifth, which would be 2 lines away, this would actually be a diminished fifth. And the reason is because a perfect fifth must be 7 semitones away. In this case, this is only 6 semitones away. So if you have a perfect interval and it gets smaller, the only place that it can go would be to diminished. It wouldn't become minor, it would have to be diminished because it can only exist on this lower path. These are the only 2 instances in the C major scale where you would get these different fourths or fifths. So if you just remember, F to B is augmented fourth and B to F is a diminished fifth, everything else is perfect, then you'll be fine. In the notes for this lesson, which I'm going to leave in the description, feel free to download, that's free. I'm going to give you a table which is going to show you what all of the different possibilities for qualities in the C major scale are. And one thing that's going to help us to be able to do this even more efficiently and quickly is inversion. So let's now talk about interval inversion. Inversion is actually really easy to understand once you know these 2 things. So we have to understand how interval size inverts and how interval quality inverts. So the way that it works is like this. If we write down all of the possible interval sizes, 1 through 8, then we can figure out how to invert these. So 4 would invert to 5, 3 inverts to 6, 2 inverts to 7. And you might be tempted to think that a unison inverts to an octave, but you have to think like with inversion, if we have the starting note here, then we invert to the same note either above it or below it, depending on whatever the interval is. So let's say we have C and D. If you have C with a D above it, then you invert to the D below it. If you have C that goes up to a G, then you would invert to the G below it. It's always starting from whatever the lower note is. That's how you would invert. So in this case, if we try to go from a C to a C right next to it, you can't really move from there. Likewise with the octave, if you have C and C above it, it's just going to go to the C below it. So it still inverts to an octave. In other words, we have the octave inverting to itself and the unison inverting to itself. In terms of quality, we still have these same paths from before, where minor inverts to major and diminished inverts to augmented. Perfect inverts to perfect, diminished inverts to augmented. Knowing these 2 things, you're going to be able to invert any interval and understand very quickly what the size and quality is going to be. So I highly recommend just memorizing these 2 things. So now let's create a list of all the possible major seconds we can have, and then we're going to use inversion to figure out what all the other seconds are going to be, as well as what all the other sevenths are going to be. And that's going to be the fastest way to do it. Rather than looking at every single note and identifying every single interval, there's a faster way to do it. So let's find all of our major seconds. So we know we have C to D, we have D to E, we have G to A to B, and I skipped one, F to G. So in other words, we have 5 total major seconds in this collection of notes. So if you know you have 5 total major seconds, then what we can do is we can invert major seconds, and this is going to be true for the inversion as well. So we can figure out that when we invert major, it becomes minor, and when we invert 2, it becomes 7. There are 5 minor sevenths in the scale. And if you think about it for a second, it's going to be because if we take this D and put it below the C, then that would be the minor seventh. If we take the E and put it below the D, that's going to be the minor seventh, and so on. So once you invert it by placing the top note below, you get the minor sevenths. So this means that if we have 7 notes in our scale and we have 5 total major seconds, then you just take the difference from 5 to 7 and conclude that the rest of the intervals must be the other quality that you haven't yet identified. So in terms of the major second, we have 5. The difference with 7 is 2, so there must be 2 minor seconds in the scale. If you remember from a previous lesson on the major scale, we only have 2 half steps, E to F and B to C. Those are the minor seconds. Everything else is a whole step. So there are 5 whole steps, 2 half steps, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, right? This would also be true if you invert those minor seconds. So for minor second, minor inverts to major, and 2 inverts to 7. So there are only 2 major sevenths in the scale. You could do this for any of the intervals in the scale using inversion. So we've now accounted for all of the major seconds, all the minor sevenths, all of the minor seconds, and all of the major sevenths. So you see how quickly you can create this table without having to label every single interval, which would be really time consuming, by using inversion as a tool. Again, I'm going to leave a table with the notes in this, and I'm going to explain how you would do this in the notes as well. So make sure to download that as a helpful resource for you to continue your understanding and study of intervals. So now we basically understand interval size and quality, how to quickly identify intervals, and inversion. But we haven't yet talked about accidentals. And when we add accidentals, there are only 3 things that can happen. The interval is going to become more narrow, it's going to stay the same, or it's going to widen. So let's see these 3 situations in action with actual intervals. Let's take the note F to A. We know that if it has no accidentals, it's going to be a major third. If we add an accidental, let's add a sharp to the lower note. Then basically the F sharp is getting closer to the A. So let's quickly reconstruct the paths these intervals can go on once they are changed. If we know the starting point is major and it gets smaller because the F sharp is closer, then the only possibility is that it becomes minor. Let's see another example of it narrowing. If we add an accidental to the top. So again, we start with our major third, and in this case, we're gonna make the A closer by adding a flat. So the only possibility, since it gets smaller, is a minor third, since it's only 1 step smaller. If we were to add a double flat, it would be a diminished third, or a double sharp, it would be a diminished third. Or if we add a sharp and a flat, then we have a diminished third, because not only is the A getting closer, the F sharp is also getting closer, so we end up with a diminished third. This would be when it narrows. Let's look at when it stays the same. The only time it's going to stay the same is when you have the same accidental on both. Meaning, if we start on F and we have an A, we know this is a major third. We're going to make it the same by adding the same accidental to both of these so that the interval size stays the same. It would be the same if you added flats to both of these. This is the only way you can stay the same, by not changing the distance. In other words, we're moving it by the same degree in both notes. In order to widen, we would need to make either the lower one or the top one further away. So if we start with a major third and we want to make it further away, it's going to have to be augmented. So we take an F and we put a sharp on the A. This would be an augmented third. Or we put a flat on the F. This would also be an augmented third. If we were to add a flat on the F and a sharp on the A, it would be doubly augmented, which is really not common, but it may pop up in certain contexts. The ones that are more common are the augmented third, using either a sharp on the note above it or the sharp below it. If you have something doubly augmented, then most likely this could just be renotated in a different way, spelled enharmonically. That's basically it. So if you understand what the intervals are going to be without accidentals, you can easily think about how they would be affected on each of these 2 individual paths. So let's just take another interval. Let's do a different one. So we start on an F and we have a D. Let's add a flat to the D. If we know that when we don't have the D, it starts as a major sixth and it's getting smaller by 1 degree, then it must be a minor sixth. If we start on an A and go to, let's say, F, we know that the unchanged version of this is going to be a minor sixth. If we add a sharp, it's going to be a major sixth, because what happens is the F gets further away from the A, meaning that the interval is widening. So it must be major if the starting point is minor. Now again, if you add multiple accidentals where they get further away even more, then this would no longer be major, but actually an augmented sixth. And this is known to happen in different kinds of music. So that's basically it in terms of intervals. So you now should have a very strong understanding of interval size and quality, quickly identifying intervals on the staff depending on whether they're space to space, line to line, or line to space. You should understand inversion, and you should also understand how intervals are affected by accidentals, whether they're getting narrower, staying the same, or widening. In the next lesson, we're going to be talking more specifically about rhythm and meter, which are really important aspects of music. If these videos have been helpful for you, then feel free to like and subscribe, comment below to let me know if there are specific topics you'd like me to talk about in this course, and I'll see you in the next lesson.